Grüß, willkommen in einem Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 49 of my figure gaming video series. In this video I'll be providing an overview of 10mm figures and why you may consider this scale. Apart from occasionally looking at the 10mm Napoleonic figures in the GHQ catalogue, 10mm has never been a scale I've displayed much interest in. I was generally happy with 15mm or 18mm for most modern figures, and 6mm or 1/300 or 1/285 scale figures. After many years, I basically concluded that 15mm is optimal for Napoleonics and ancient figure gaming. When we swing over to World War II and Cold War, I normally use 6mm figures. Occasionally I did try different combinations. While I was heavily involved in getting new gamers for Napoleonics and Ancients, one of the gamers introduced me to a 6mm Ancient Force Mix, and we used those figures for several games of Lost Battles, Ancients. In this case, my gaming Kameraden decided to base his 6mm on standard 4cm wide bases. But while I agree it looked good, I felt that the real benefit of moving the 6mm was to reduce the size of the playing area, which required a smaller base. When we swing over to the area of playing areas and ergonomics for gaming, I initially felt a playing area about 70cm deep and 120cm wide seems to be an optimal size for two gamers to have a game while remaining seated for most of the game. While I've created a number of smaller playing areas similar to the size I've just described and even smaller, in the end I decided on a standard 4 foot by 3 foot playing area, or 90cm by 120cm. This was for both 15mm Ancients and Napoleonics and 6mm World War II and Cold War gaming, so my interest in smaller playing areas waned, at least for a period of time. Then I discovered the old SPI pre-stag rules, board game rules for Ancients. While in these rules the actual battlefield was reasonably small, the rules encouraged pre-battle manoeuvring. The armies typically started in their camps and sallied out to do battle. In this case you needed more playing area real estate. Of course, this was a figure game conversion of the old SPI pre-stag board game rules, not the board game. My initial solution was to use a larger playing area, in this case two 80cm by 120cm insulation sheets, which formed a 160cm by 120cm playing area, or 5 1/3 feet by 4 feet. Then I thought about using smaller elements, using 6mm figures. As a result, I created my 6mm Ancient army using 3cm wide bases. In pre-stag, or the figure game conversion, which I call P17CW, the elements use movement trays, which allow you to place 3 infantry elements or 2 mounted elements in each movement tray. This worked and allowed me to retain my standard 3 by 4 foot playing area. In the area of Napoleonics, I went down a slightly different path with 6mm, in this case using standard 3cm square bases, which contained 3 ranks of foot or 1 or 2 ranks of cavalry. This allowed me to either reduce my playing area size or increase the number of elements I could field. This also seemed to work, however I always had a major issue with 6mm on this base size. While in mass formation 6mm figures look good, the elements are fiddly and I don't have the same impact as masses of 15mm figures, at least visually, especially when I photograph them. For World War II or Cold War, this is not an issue as most of the figures are vehicles or AFVs. But for Napoleonics and Ancients, it just did not feel right, as you can see by looking at this image of my 6mm Napoleonic Force Mix. I have to admit this is purely an aesthetic issue, and there is no practical issue with this base size. I suspect this aesthetic issue is why DBMM recommends you base your 6mm on the same size bases as 15mm. I think this works for new players, but as I have a large 15mm Force Mix, I saw little point going down the 6mm path with 4cm wide bases. I still use my 6mm Ancients, and I must admit I think the 6mm Ancients work well with movement trays, and I do use the Napoleonics where I still don't think aesthetically it looks quite as good, but nonetheless I admit they give me good games with a reduced requirement for playing area real estate. I do not wish to discourage anyone going down this path. It does offer some real benefit, but after all this experimentation I mainly focus on 15mm for Ancients and Napoleonics and 6mm for World War II and Cold War. This has especially been true since I started to adopt US basing for my 15mm Napoleonic figures. That base size is 2 cm wide by 3 cm deep, and the figures are 2 rank deep. And while this is very crowded and restricts what figures I can use on the base, it works and gives me the same benefit as 3 centimetre square bases on using 6mm figures, so why bother? Then I got interested in American Civil War gaming. I was considering getting an American Civil War force mix and wanted to go down a different scale path. I saw little point in duplicating my Napoleonic basing and figure scale. I wanted to do something different for ACW. Initially this occurred because I looked at plastic figures which were 13mm in size from Warlord. This interested me because of their great value. The other thing which interested me was the possibility of using smaller base sizes. When I originally collected 15mm figures, I used first generation minifigs in the most part, which was actually 15mm, true 15mm size or 1/100 scale, if not a little bit smaller. The rules I used told me 4 infantry figures needed to be based on an element 3 centimetres wide by 1 centimetre deep. This was the basing I used back before the year 2000. Unfortunately, with the growth of 15mm into something closer to 18mm, the base size, or this base size, was not viable, and it changed to 4 centimetres wide, which is where we end up today. The issue with these larger elements, or base sizes, was the playing areas needed to grow or the number of figures needed to drop, although I must admit the elements did look very nice. The latter was the most common solution, as playing area size could not really grow any further, generally for most gamers. To avoid this, you need smaller figures, which initially was 13mm plastic figures, at least in my mind. While investigating these 13mm plastic figures, I also decided to relook at 10mm and was surprised at how large the range was. The issue with Warlord is the range is limited. This is not an issue with American Civil War, but if this scale was going to be a good idea, I would have liked to try other armies, such as a 7-year war force mix. Warlord could not provide me with this, but 10mm could. However, I have to admit the main reason I went with 10mm metal figures was I am more familiar with metal. For American Civil War, the Warlord range of figures is more than adequate, and that's not an issue in any way, shape or form. I personally feel going down the 13mm path is just as viable as what I ended up doing, once you've confirmed the range of figures meets your needs. Let's now look at 10mm figures in more detail. The first 10mm figures I came across was GHQ. GHQ does possess a reasonable range of 10mm Napoleonic figures. It has about 60 10mm Napoleonic figures, and the picture looks very nice indeed. The issue is the range. The Austrians consist of only 8 different figure types. The main ones are present, but there is a lack of Austrian cavalry, especially light. I also find them rather expensive. For World War II, GHQ is my go-to brand, but as a typical force mix only consists of 40 to 50 elements, the cost is not really the major issue in that particular case. If you move over to the American Civil War range, it is much better. You can easily feel the Union or Confederate force using the GHQ range, but at $14 for 24 figures, I felt the cost was high, and as I'm not based in the US and mailing costs are high, this would even be more expensive for me. I suspect if you're based in the US, this may well be an optimal range to use for 10mm American Civil War, but if you live in other countries, there are other options which are more attractive. At the moment, my go-to 10mm supplier is Pendraken. The costs are only slightly less than GHQ, but the mailing cost is significantly less. When you are shipping these types of figures, weight becomes a major issue. 40 vehicles of GHQ 1285 do not weigh very much, but a typical 200 figure force mix of 10mm weighs a lot more. This has a big impact on shipping, so you should always check the shipping costs when considering the best supplier to use. In terms of range of figures, it's hard to fault Pendraken. Ranging from ancients to sci-fi, almost any period is covered. If we drill down into ancients, we can see the period of 600 BC to 600 AD is reasonably well covered. But I must admit, in some of these periods, the number of nations are minimal. The late imperial only has Romans and Sassanids. The early periods has Romans, Dacians, Gaelic and Sarmatians. The Punic Wars has Romans, Carthaginians and Spanish. The Classic only has Persian, Greek and Indian for some strange reason, possibly Alexander the Great. Within each nationality, the range can be rather limiting, with the Greeks consisting of only 12 different figure types. The lack of Macedonians is rather puzzling, but the range is reasonable nonetheless if you want to go down this path. The Napoleonic range was similar. However, for the major nations, all the required troop types are present. The Austrians did have the required cavalry types required to field an army. This was my main or initial concern if I went down the 10mm path for Napoleonics, as I needed an Austrian force mix in order to make this fly. However, if we swing back to American Civil War, with the American Civil War, everything you could possibly want is provided. This was a rather good range, which is the reason why I've decided to start with a Union force mix using this range. The rules I use, a figure game version of the SPI board game, or a SPI board game, blue and grey, only requires 50 to 75 elements per side. So a typical force mix cost me about £120, using a 3cm wide base and 4 figures per element. The next range I looked at was Old Glory 10mm figures. The American Civil War range consists of 21 figure types, not including equipment. This was a decent range, but not as good as Pendraken. The figure quality seems good. I'm not going to say the figures paint themselves, which is a mark of a truly excellent figure quality, but for 10mm they're as good as you can expect. The next range I looked at was Lancer Miniatures. This has 16 figure types for the American Civil War. This is not a large range, but the cost seems rather low, so there are some benefits going down this particular manufacturing path. I'm certain there are many other suppliers of 10mm figures, and between the 3 suppliers I've listed, I feel most players would be able to field a very wide range of force mixes. Not as wide as 15mm or 25mm, but a reasonable range nonetheless. My initial plan was to go back to 3cm wide by 1cm deep bases, with the cavalry probably 1.5cm deep as the artillery. However, in the end I went with a 3cm square base. But players could go down the 3cm wide by 1cm deep path if they so desire. This decision really depends on the rules, as the rules I'll be using is a SPI board game conversion of the blue and grey board game into a figure gaming format. Square was the best option for me in this particular case. As a side note, there is one other advantage with 10mm figures if you use the 15mm US basing. This basing was likely developed for older true 15mm figures many years ago. So if you use these bases, which are 2cm wide by 3cm deep, or 3/4 inch wide by 1 inch deep, the types of modern 15mm figures you can place on them is limited. With 10mm there is no issue, and I do suspect this is another sweet spot for 10mm figures. However, let's go back to the main topic. The objective is to reduce the playing area size by using smaller elements, while retaining the feel of large figures. I'd expect 10mm figures would be easy to pick up and move around, something which can be an issue with 6mm figures. Of course, at this point, you may be asking yourself, the difference between 4cm wide and 3cm wide is not great enough to make a difference, surely. But 3cm is 25% smaller than 4cm, meaning the playing area should cover an area 25% larger, or the playing area can be 25% smaller. A 4-foot wide playing area can now be 3 feet wide with 3cm wide bases, and this gives you the same gaming experience. It will take me a while to paint and base up my Union and Confederate force mix, so it will be a while before I can determine if this experiment is a success, or if it's an interesting diversion from 15mm but does not replace 15mm. I suspect the answer will be the latter, but I have high hopes it will be successful enough for me to have many American Civil War games with my comrades. And so this concludes episode 49 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, in this case looking at 10mm metal figures. All the images in this video are 10mm figures taken from the internet. Since I originally created this video, I have purchased a Union and Confederate force mix, as well as a 10mm German, British and Soviet World War II force mix. But when I created this second version of the video, I have not painted or based anything, so I have nothing to photograph. Once I get my figures on the field of battle, I am certain I will be providing some photos so other gamers can see what they look like using my chosen basing system. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.